Good morning, good afternoon, everyone, and good evening to all my fellow participants and also the organizer. At the outset, I would sincerely thank the organizers, perhaps Virginia and team, and also the other technical staff from Fiji as well. And perhaps I must also thank my supervisor, Professor Dubey, for having introduced me to this field of indentured labor in Reunion Island. The title that I'm going to speak in today's conference is basically on the Lazaret and the Grande Chaloupe. How actually is the idea of, what I call the sanitization system actually took place. As I've already stated in my paper, basically my paper will be divided into two parts. That is one, at the global health, at the global context, and subsequently I'll come down to the indentured immigration in La Reunion. As I've already started, the idea of this public health and indentured immigrations, when you closely look at the genesis and perhaps the etymological derivations, perhaps what we actually goes through is the Encyclopedia Britannica defines Lazaretto as an institution, perhaps a hospital for those with contagious disease, or a building or a ship used for detention in quarantine. And quarantine as the separation and restriction of travel of human or other animal that may have come into contact with infections of disease. So that's the basic concepts on how the idea of Lazaret and the idea of this Lazaretto, which is derived from the word that's actually started. So this origin of the system, when you closely looked at, it was somewhere in the 14th century. The growth of this maritime supremacy and perhaps the maritime trade among the European colonial power. So it assumed some important features, and the subsequent plague, which seems to have come from this trade and commerce via ship returning from the Levant, led to the adoption of the quarantine system in Venice. That was the first historical evidences as far as my research is concerned. I had just traced back the idea of this Lazaret to Venice. And originally the period was for 30 days, that's a trentina, though this was later extended to 40 days, which in the process on the name quarantina. So as I said, quarantina, which means 40 days, then subsequently what we call quarantine in the English or the Anglophone grammar. However, the practice of isolating the allegedly diseased person dates back to very long, and that is what we call the ancient period. For instance, if you looked at the Atlantic slave trade and the indentured period, so by the 19th century, the British imperial prosperity was at its height. They have already surpassed the Portuguese and the Spanish Empire, which was already in the competitions for explorations in the Atlantic and the Indian Ocean region, and which perhaps by the time the empire of the British stretched from around the globe, the military power has increased enormously, the wealth accrued through the slave system, and certain navigation acts were also implemented. And if I may put perhaps this way, so the idea of this Western civilization was solidly and squarely lies in the Atlantic slave trade beginning, and subsequently what we call the forced labor and the indentured migrations. Now, if the port has sustained, of course, some of the historians argue that the British were very much averse to what we call the quarantine system, which they call it very unchristian or whatever, which is anti-commerce. But nevertheless, this quarantine or the port sanitary system was actually developed with a dual motive. One, basically preventing the introduction and the spread of cholera, which has been in pandemic in Europe, for instance, from 1830, and then you have 1847, then 1853, then 1865, then 1873, and 1884, so on and so on. Quite a good number of pandemic that we have already faced, even in the early historical period time as well. So let us call the early, instead of the early historical, early modern period, which somehow prove, and to provide an alternative to this quarantine, which have proved somehow incompatible to the ideas of what we call the British desire for commitment to free trade. And right before the introduction of this port sanitary system, as I said, quarantine was employed in response to certain imported disease. But as the British, thrive on this maritime commerce, it is somehow, giving them some drawback in the realm of this commerce. And as a result, they have developed one system in response to this quarantine called the port sanitary system. And this quarantine restriction somehow berated in Britain as anti-commercial, as I've already explained, anti-social, and if not anti-Christian. By 1870, the quarantine was widely opposed, as I've already argued right beforehand. And in the process, they have, somehow put up some measures in order to control this system, and they call it the port sanitary system, which some of the historians have called it the English system. So this line of thought was also closely followed in the US. Look at the history of external hygiene, and the port quarantine system is thus inextricably bound with the history of oceanic commerce in the United States of America across the transatlantic migration. In response to the periodic outbreak of yellow fever, Pennsylvania colonial legislature adopted a series of acts that was intended to curb the system or to stop the spreading of the yellow fever epidemics in 1793. And in the process, they have already introduced several legislatures in 1806 and 1818, where you have seen the Board of Health and the Port City of Philadelphia. These both actually operated a quarantine station. This quarantine station was known as the Lazaretto, which was located on the Delaware, about 10 miles below Philadelphia. And the station actually occupied a 10-acre site with a river in front, which was basically designed for sanitation purpose. That is 926 feet wide. Its physical plan included residence, stables, kitchen, hospital, consisting of 3-story, 50-foot square, central portion, and 2 wings. So these are some of the issues with regard to quarantine, Lazaretto, epidemics in the global context. Now, coming down squarely to our main topic of what we call the indentured systems and the quarantine system, perhaps for your information, if I may remind you. So apart from England and apart from US, even in Asia, perhaps in the Middle East, we have the Lazaretto that was established way back in the 24th December 1897. That was precisely to quarantine people coming from India, the source of India, where on their route to England, they have to be quarantined then only when they were cleansed, or they were supposed to be cleansed, then only then they can move on. So all these systems were actually designed in order to curb the spreading of what we call the yellow fever and different kind of disease. So with regard to all these issues, now my point as to what extent, look at the picture which I just shown you. This was the picture depicting Lazaretto in La Reunion. This is the mountain. And today we have a lot of beautiful roads out here, but if you look at the colonial system at that point of time, it's all very historic, perhaps and nostalgic for some of the indentured descendants as well. The Grande Chaloupe, the Lazaret, was also called in the local parlance as the Grande Chaloupe. This is the old historic building where we have this, thanks to my friends who are in La Reunion, perhaps to Sarif, and also Adel and John Rezi Ramsami, Jules Sagodira, those people who has been instrumental in supplying this picture. The photo credit goes to them. And then this is the picture, basically, that looked at. I have taken it from one internet sources, but rather I have given the credit to Sarif from St. Pierre in La Reunion, where they have, a beautifully designed that this Lazaret was not only for the Indian indentured immigrant, but then we have from, Mozambique, Madagascar, and Zanzibar, and then all these places. And this is the map depicting. And to put it in a very proper context, now let me say, as soon as the indentured labor arrived on the shores of Reunion Island by sea, the first thing that they do was you disembark them and immediately quarantine them at the Lazaret. This quarantine actually was intended, as far as the archive, in the British archive in New Delhi is concerned, it's called National Archive of India now. So the quarantine is meant for 10 days. And then immediately they will be inspected by a local doctor and in the presence of the commissioned immigrations, where they have to certify that these people actually come on this condition and so on and so forth. We actually have two Lazaret in La Réunion, as far as our archive record is concerned. One at the Ravines of St, which is basically 4 miles by sea and 10 miles by land from St.Denis. The other one is called Grande Chaloupe, a little bit lower, just about 4 miles to the south of St. Jacques. This Lazaret, in fact, was actually the previous one has actually catered to the needs of those people before the advent of the Franco-British Conventions. But the Franco-British Convention, which was signed in 1860 and subsequently, put into effect in 1861, from that archival material, we have seen that 42,000 indentured Indian has already arrived. But when you cross-check with some other historian like Michel Morimoto and also Professor Sudel Fiuma, who is no more at this moment, so we have seen the other side of the story that this Lazaret was not only intended for the Indian indentured laborer, but rather it has also catered to the need of other migrants from Mozambique and some other places as well. So this building was built in 1861 and occupied, said to have been occupied until 1931. And perhaps it got to the 1930s December, all right. By December, the story all goes like this. There is a typical history behind. By December 28, 1848, by the Declaration of Sarda Gariga Declarations. So the emancipations of slaves actually started, where in Barasua, in St.Denis, more than 58,308 slaves were freed immediately. That the slaves feel so excited and they move up to the mountain and and at the point of Mafat, Piton, Ginage, and all those places. In the process, so the farm, the plantation farm was left, and thereby slowly and steadily they have started importing, indentured laborers. Those who they have imported by 1820 as well has already left primarily because of the maltreatment, and subsequently after the signing of the Franco-British Convention, quite a good number of Indian had come. So this has given the French and as well as the British government for some sorts of what we call the sanitations, which in the process, if there has been some venereal disease, contagious disease, this has to be taken care of by putting them into the quarantine system. So therefore, so when the island had, before the signing of what we call the Franco-British Convention, we already have that there are more than 74,472 indentured laborers. Just looked at the aerial picture of Reunion Island. So this is the beautiful island from the pictures where we have St.Denis here. The Lazaret is somewhere here near the possession, we call it La Possession. And this is the archive material where the design of the Lazaret building is being carved out. And then this is the room of the indentured hut, where I have taken the picture during my field walk in 2008 at Colimación, Botanic Lazaret at Colimación. And then this is the renovated building of Grande Chaloupe with the tram or the railway station at nearby. And thank you so much for the patient hearing. This is what I can tell you as far as the Grande Chaloupe and the Lazaret is concerned. But the point that I'm trying to emphasize is that how much does this, the idea of this global health and the idea of this quarantine was actually started way back in the early 18th century, which has come down even to the indentured aspect. So a lot of literature has been written in the Francophone literatures, but I do believe that this kind of sanitations or this kind of quarantine system has been dealt with very scant attention as far as the English or the Anglophone literature is concerned, which might be contributions in the realm of these indentured laborers. So thank you again, and thank you one and all.